Good evening. I'm Gretchen Crosby-Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. I'm very pleased to welcome David Brooks to campus this evening for a visit to talk on our society's response to populism, tribalism, and declining faith in social institutions. A few preliminary notes to share before we get started. First, a couple of upcoming events. Tomorrow at the International House, we are hosting a roundtable conversation on local government in an age of federal dysfunction, featuring the mayors of Boston, New Orleans, Denver, and Gary. This Wednesday in this room, we're hosting a lunchtime discussion about the upcoming Illinois state elections, featuring reporters from WBEZ and Politico. This event is in anticipation of our three organizations co-hosting a Democratic gubernatorial primary forum here on March 1st. You can find out more about all of our upcoming events on our website at politics.uchicago.edu. I want to note something about audience questions. After Mr. Brooks makes some preliminary remarks, we will open up the floor to take questions from the audience. Please raise your hand. Mr. Brooks will call on you, and one of our student ambassadors will hand you a microphone. As usual, we give priority for the first three questions to students. Last, please make sure that your phones are on silent. And here to formally introduce our speaker is Michael Schumer. Michael is a fourth-year history major from Muttontown, New York. During his first year here, Michael founded the Maroon Veterans Alliance, one of our proudest examples of a student-run IOP program that has been so successful that it is now its own registered student organization. He is now editor-in-chief of the Chicago Journal of Foreign Policy. Please join me in welcoming Michael to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm very excited to be here with all you tonight. It is truly a unique honor to introduce Mr. David Brooks for an appropriate event on the rise of populism and responses to it. Born in Toronto, Mr. Brooks was raised in New York City and Philadelphia before matriculating at the University of Chicago and subsequently receiving his bachelor's degree in history in 1983. Immediately following his time in the college, Mr. Brooks began working as a police reporter at the City News Bureau of Chicago before leaving for the Washington Times. In 1986, Mr. Brooks joined the Wall Street Journal, where he continued his film reviews while also editing the journal's book reviews. Mr. Brooks even moved to Brussels to work as an editor and correspondent for the journal, gaining an even richer international perspective. Mr. Brooks's final stint at the journal included a role as an editor of the opinion page before leaving in 1994. Most recently, Mr. Brooks is globally known as an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, starting in September of 2003, focusing on contemporary politics, culture, and social sciences with thoughtful commentary on today's most pressing issues. He also teaches at Yale University and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. However, perhaps he's most known around here for being the first Class Day speaker in UChicago's history last June. We are so fortunate to have you here tonight at the Institute of Politics, and I wanted to thank you so much for joining us. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Thank you. It was an honor to be the Class Day speaker. It was a very UChicago event. They sort of wanted to walk in the direction of having celebrity speakers, but they started with me just sort of as a baby. I was sort of the gateway drug to Stephen Colbert in a few years, so I was happy to play that role. It's actually weird. I was met with some students earlier, and I was telling them if you had told me in 1983 when I left here that I would walk through campus misty-eyed and nostalgic, I would have thought you were crazy. But walking here, I really felt that. I feel, I don't know, especially those who are older, I feel more attached to this place now than I did at any point, even when I was a student here. I feel so, every year, a little more formed by the University of Chicago. I will be brief. I know this is a University of Chicago audience, and you didn't come here to hear me speak. You came here to hear yourselves speak. And so I'll try to get out of the way of that. And because I did go here and felt at home here, I should start by saying I'm a bookish person. When I was 7, I wanted to write I read a book called Paddington the Bear, and I decided at that moment I wanted to become a writer. I remember in high school I wanted to date a woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so, and it's really, there probably haven't been 100 days gone by since I was 7 that I haven't written something. And now I get to write a column as a conservative columnist for the New York Times, which is a job I liken to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company. And then in 1979, the admissions officers at Wesleyan, Brown, and Columbia decided I should come here. And so I came here, which is a bookish place, and I majored in history and celibacy. And I'm not like today's students. When you talk to today's students, they're all kind of amazing. They, what are you doing at spring break? It's, I'm unicycling across Thailand while reading to lepers, that sort of thing. The students I've met with here in the years in visits past, they've had this amazing ability to dominate discussion while doing none of the reading, which is impressive. I was more of a bookish person. This is literally true. I managed a boxer. My freshman roommate and I, he was the kosher killer. And we didn't actually train boxing. We read books about boxing. And because of a freakish set of buys, he made it to the semifinals of the Chicago Golden Gloves. And he just came out swinging with his arms over his head. And the other boxer, who was a real boxer, shot back because he'd never seen anything like this. And then 93 seconds later realized, well, one uppercut will really end this fight. And that's what happened. And so books and ideas, and really what the U of C stands for, which is the power of the mind, is foremost to me. But as you get older, you get a little more emotional, a little more, I think for guys, hopefully a little more feminine, more in touch with the feminine side. I'm the only man in America who read that book, Eat, Pray, Love, all the way through. By page 123, I was actually lactating. It was amazing. And so you get to where you realize other things are more important. And so I'm going to start my little political discussion with a little anthropology of who we are, because I think it's important to understand where we are politically. And that's to say that our rational brain, the bookish part of our brain, is actually the third most important part of our consciousness. And the first is, as Augustine would tell us, the desiring heart. I read about a guy recently who bought a house which had a driveway, and then next to the driveway, a bamboo stand. And he hated bamboo, so he chopped down the bamboo. He took a hatchet to the roots. He chopped them up. He dug a hole, poured plant poison all throughout the hole, then put gravel over the plant poison and cement over the gravel. And 2 years later, bamboo shoots shooting up through the cement. And I think we have that in ourselves, which is our desire. That, as Augustine said, we're desiring creatures. We're always on the move. We're like existential sharks. And that we're desiring something. And as Augustine said, you be careful what you love because you become what you love. And I think mostly what we desire is fusion with something else. The ability to shed the skin and join with some other person or some other thing. There's a book called, I hope some of you have read, named Captain Corelli's Mandolin, written by Louis de Bernier. And early in that book, there's an old guy talking to his daughter about his love for his late wife. And the guy says, love itself is what is left over when being in love has burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew toward each other underground. And when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we found out that we were one tree and not two. And that's what the heart wants. And so that's the first important organ. The second is the yearning soul. Now, I'm not in the business of telling you whether to believe in God or not. That's not my department. But I would like to persuade you, as Plato or anybody who we read here in the Common Core, that you do have a piece of you that has no shape, size, or color, but is of infinite value and dignity. And rich and successful people don't have more of it than poor and less successful people. And that what this thing does is yearn for righteousness. Everybody I've ever met wants to be a good person, wants to lead a righteous life. Even criminals, when you meet them, they want you to know that what they did was either excusable or good, actually. And so everybody I've ever met has this yearning, and it never goes away. I've noticed this, and for those who are older in the room, you talk to people, especially over 60, often their lives have this shape, which is sort of a two-mountain shape. They graduated from school, and they thought, well, that's my mountain. And it tended to be career-oriented. It was identity building, making a mark on the world. And they climbed that mountain, and sometimes they achieved that mountain, it wasn't that satisfying, or they got knocked off it, or something bad happened. And then they realized, well, that actually wasn't my mountain. They have a second mountain, which is how they fill the later part of their lives, which tends to be more spiritual, less building the ego, and more pouring forth into something else. And so it's just this yearning of the soul to do good. And one of the things that desire-filled and heart-filled people do is they want to join something and they want it to be good for the world. And the way they do that is they build communities or they build moral ecologies, which is a culture in which it's easier to be good. And people build their moral ecologies to solve the problem of their time. And they build them for a time, and then they work for a time, and then they stop working, and so they have to build a new one. And there's a historian of ideas, I've forgotten her name right now, but she says history moves by a process of ratchet, hatchet, pivot, ratchet. You build a culture, it solves your problems, then it stops working, so you hatchet it up, you pivot, and you build another. And I happen to think we're at one of those hatchet moments. These moments can be bumpy. But I want to just tell you about 3 of these moral ecologies that I think our country has gone through in the last 50 or 60 years. The first was, say, between 1932 and 1968, generations that faced the Depression, the Second World War, big challenges. They needed big institutions to respond to these big challenges. And so they had a very group-oriented culture, which you could call, we're all in this together. So they joined the army, they joined labor unions, big corporations like IBM, and they had a very communal organization. If you lived on the south side here, not far from here, you probably, about, 3 miles west of here, you probably went to the Nabisco plant. If you grew up in that neighborhood, you went to the Nabisco plant, you joined the same union your father did. There was no TVs and no air conditioning in them. So in the summer times, the doors were open and the kids were flooding from home to home. It was a very tight community filled with coffee clutches, barbecues, babysitting co-ops. If they asked you, where are you from? You didn't say, I'm from Chicago. You said, I'm from 59th and Pulaski, because the neighborhood was what defined you. And they were tight neighborhoods, and you served organizations. There was a guy who worked for Boss Daly named John Ferry, and he served in the state legislature for the machine. And as a reward for all these years of service, Daly said, you can have a couple years in Congress in Washington. And so the press asked him, well, how are you going to vote when you get to Congress? And he said, I will go to Washington to help represent Mayor Daley. For 21 years, I represented the mayor in the legislature, and he was always right. So that's deference to authority. And that culture had a lot of good things about it. A lot of us yearn for some of the tight communities they had back then. And they had a more humility back then, frankly. But it was a moral ethos that had some failures, obviously. It tolerated a lot of racism, a lot of sexism, a lot of anti-Semitism. There was a lot of emotional coldness and conformity. Fathers had a great deal of trouble expressing their emotion, especially to their kids. The food was really boring. And so they patched it up, and that was sort of happened in the 60s. And to me, the symptomatic moment of that cultural shift was Super Bowl III, 1969 or 70. On one side of the sideline was a quarterback named Johnny Unitas, classic 50s guy, crew cut, high top shoes. On the other side was a quarterback named Joe Namath. Long hair, swinger, anti-institutional. Joe Namath wrote a memoir called I Can't Wait Until Tomorrow Because I Get Better Looking Every Day. Johnny Unitas would not have written that memoir. And so you had a new shift in the culture. What was favored was young, not old, expressive, not reticent, casual, not formal, to be a rebel, not a conformist, to be an individual, not institutional. And this ethos, which sort of, represented by the Port Huron Statement in 1962, was more, I'm free to be myself. And it was a much more individualistic ethos, and it had a lot of great accomplishments. Civil rights movement, feminism, the peace movement, rock and roll. I don't think we would have had the Silicon Valley if we didn't have the creativity of a very rebellious and individualistic and innovation-oriented culture. And so it did some pretty great things. And the ethos of this was liberation, emancipation. Liberated from dogma, liberated from class, liberated to be free and to be myself. It had some weaknesses, a lot of narcissism, but I think we're sort of at the moment where we're beginning to see the core weaknesses. And to me, we're sort of running out the string on this individualistic ethos. and it's represented in three social crises. The first is a crisis of social solidarity, a crisis of isolation. In 1980, 20% of Americans reported feeling lonely. Now twice as many do. Currently, 35% of people over 45 are chronically lonely. A generation ago, only 8% of Americans live alone. Now it's 30 or 40%. In 1970, married couples entertained on average 15 times a year. Now it's down to 8 times a year. Only 8% of Americans report having important conversations with their neighbors. The fastest growing political party is unaffiliated. The fastest growing religious movement is unaffiliated. And so we're just seeing a lot more loneliness, especially down the income scale. And so the loneliness translates into suicide rate. Suicide rate has been shooting up and rising since 1999. And as Durkheim taught us, suicide is a proxy for loneliness. The opioid addiction is shooting up, so now 50, 60,000 people die a year of opiate addiction, and opiate addiction is just slow motion suicide. And so that's the first one. The second is what you might call a crisis of alienation, people feeling alienated from their institutions. If you asked people during that first we're in this together era, do you trust government to do the right thing most of the time? For decade after decade, 70 or 80% say, yeah, I trust government to do the right thing most of the time. Now it's down to 22%. So that's just a sharp drop. A generation ago, if you asked Americans, do you trust your neighbors, the people right around you, to be honest and trustworthy? A generation ago, 60% say, yeah, my people around me are sort of trustworthy. Now it's down to 32%. And among millennials, it's 19%. So there's been a loss of alienation, a loss of trust, a loss of respect for our institutions, including all institutions except the military, and maybe even a loss of sense of what's our national narrative. What is the cohering sense of peoplehood that joins us all together across our diversity? And then the third, which I just talked about with the students, which is a crisis of meaning. Crisis, what I call the Telos crisis. The ethos of individualism says that everybody has to come up with their own purpose and meaning in life. If your name is Aristotle or Nietzsche, maybe you can do that. For the rest of us, it's a challenge. And so you have a lot of people who do not have a sense of what their purpose and meaning is. They're also raised in a meritocracy, which is the most important cultural formative agent of our lives. And as I wrote in a book recently, that the meritocracy encourages you to pay a lot of attention to your resume virtues, what makes you good at your job, but it doesn't necessarily encourage you to pay attention to your eulogy virtues, whether you're honest, brave, courageous, capable of great love, even though we all know the latter are more important. And I was saying I noticed this among my students. They get out of school, something bad happens in their 20s, and they get fired, romantic breakup, something terrible, and then they call me because they've totally collapsed, and the mood and the voice has utterly changed. And I've come to call it the Telos crisis. Nietzsche said, he who has a why to live for can endure any how. And if they haven't thought, why am I doing this? What's my long-term goal? What's my moral purpose here? They don't know why. When the bad thing happens, they sort of collapse. And it's not their fault at all. If you look at commencement speeches, when we try to tell students how to think morally about their lives, if you've been to commencements, basically what happens is they get a highly successful person to give a speech on why career success is not important. And what do we give them? We give them a bunch of empty boxes. You get out of college, you're trying to figure out, where do I plant myself? What do I devote my life to? And we give them these empty boxes from the culture of autonomy and freedom. What should I do with my life? Be free. They're drowning in freedom. Telling them to be free does no good at all. So then they say, well, what's my path? And so we give them another empty box, the box of possibility. Be brave. You can do anything you set your mind to. Take risks. Again, no help at all, because they don't know what's valuable, what's not valuable. Where can I go for authority, they ask. Who can I trust? We say, look inside yourself. Follow your passion. The answers to all your problems are deep inside you. That's the one place they don't know about because it hasn't yet been formed. And then we give them the final box, which is autonomy. Do it all on your own. And these empty boxes are of no help at all. David Foster Wallace described it in the famous Kenyan address. He describes something that doesn't have much to do with physical circumstances or the economy or the stuff that gets talked about in the news. It's a sadness. I see it in my generations and my friends in different ways. It manifests itself in a kind of lostness, This is a generation that has an inheritance of absolutely nothing as far as meaningful moral values. So if you leave people naked and alienated and alone, they're going to do what any human being would do in those circumstances. They're going to revert to tribe. And so we've seen, to me, the rise of populism is the natural product of these three crises. The people like Donald Trump understood that we're no longer having normal debates about the size of government, big government versus small government. We're having debates about what you can belong to and who's going to protect you in a dangerous world. The populists like Donald Trump understood you don't need to have to build a new system, you just have to tear down the old culture that's not working for people. In the late 60s, some of you remember Abbie Hoffman, not a great political theorist, but really good at political drama to expose the weakness of the old order. To me, he's not only this, but Donald Trump is the Abbie Hoffman of our era. He just takes every wound and he pokes a hole in it repeatedly and repeatedly. And so they've led this return to tribe, this negative polarization. And I spent an afternoon a few months ago with Steve Bannon, and if anybody of you are involved in whether he should come here, I highly recommend he come here and that you go hear him. I spent this hour with him, or several hours, he lives a few blocks from me. It was like being with Trotsky in 1905. I mean, the guy he knows who his intellectual antecedents are. He knows he has got a 50-year plan to take over this institution, that institution, that institution. He knows who his international allies are. Nigel Farage over here, Viktor Orban over there. He's got a tremendous coherence to his worldview. And it was kind of inspiring. I didn't agree with it at all, but at least there's a coherence and a conviction. And what I notice about people who are like me, don't like this, we don't have any of that. And so the tribalists who believe in a siege mentality, an apocalyptic mindset, build walls, erect barriers, us versus them, zero-sum mindset, they've taken the step on this era because they understood it first. And those of us who didn't understand the cultural shift, we're back on our heels. And so they're on the march, surging illiberalism. And when I look at the people like me, whether on right and left, who don't want tribalism to be our future, they don't want I'm free to be myself to be replaced with return to tribe. The first thing you notice is we know what we're against, but we don't quite know what we're for. We have some words, cultural pluralism, ethnic diversity, civic conversation, but we don't have a fighting faith the way they do. We've sort of taken our faith for granted so long we've forgotten the words to articulate it. Second, we're dispersed and disorganized. Third, we're demoralized. And so a lot of us are feeling sort of homeless and appalled at the trends that are happening all across the world. And yet I've noticed over the past 2 or 3 months that it's like looking at a valley and people are starting to come out of their barns. That wherever I go around the country, people are beginning to start things. And in my experience, these new organizations, of which I could probably name hundreds, that are just getting started, fall into 5 or 6 buckets. The first is a civic education bucket. People who believe we've got to redefine what democracy is and why we believe in it. The second is a social capital bucket. People who think the problem is a lack of common culture and social capital, and they want to rebuild communities. The third is a social mobility bucket. The problem is economic inequality. It's the alienation across the class line. The fourth is the spiritual secular sermons, who think the crisis is fundamentally a problem of meaning. We don't know what our national meaning is, and a lot of us are not united by common cultural and moral meanings. And the final is the depolarizers, the people who want to bring red and blue together just to get to know one another. And so there's all these movements, and I'm hoping we'll all, over the next few months and few years, take all these different movements and put them together into one force that will be a counterforce to tribalism. In the progressive era, all these movements also arose. The settlement house movement, Jane Addams here in Chicago, the temperance movement, the environmental movement, the clean government movement, the social gospel, and they all joined to form progressivism. And that had real power and cultural purpose. And so to me, we're in the pivot point between these two movements, between tribalism and some form of commitment to pluralism. And the final thing I just wanted to say was about the crisis of meaning, just for the students. I mentioned that I believe in the power of love, first of all, the power of the desiring heart. I ran into a guy in Houston who's a hairdresser, and he told me this story. There was a woman in Houston who was a pianist, and she was going to go out to San Francisco to be with her fiance. So she thought she'd get her hair done before she moved. So she went to a place called Etude de Paris, and she saw a guy named David cutting hair. She walks in, she goes to the back of the salon, puts on the gown people wear when they're getting their hair done, and she calls her mom and says, "I've just met the man I'm actually going to marry." And so she comes out and she gets her hair washed, and then she's sitting in David's chair, and he's doing chit chat, and he says, "Well, so what's your story?" And she says, "Well, I'm a pianist. I'm about to move to San Francisco to be with my fiance, but I won't do it if you'll marry me." And as David tells the story, I looked at my scissors and I never felt more free than I did at that moment. And he said, "It's a deal." And they've been married for 17 years. But the story is about the desiring heart. We don't all fall in love that fast, but we do all make commitments. And to me, most of us in the course of our life make 4 big commitments: to a spouse and family, to a vocation, to a philosophy and faith, and to a community. And the quality and fulfillment of our lives depends on how well we make and execute those commitments. And to me, a commitment is falling in love with something and then building a structure of behavior around it for those moments when love falters. Jews believe in God, but they keep kosher just to be safe, just to give them that structure. And our commitments give us our identities. Our commitments give us our sense of purpose. Somebody did a study in 2007, the Gallup organization. They asked, which country around the world do most people feel a sense of meaning and purpose in their life? The #1 country in the world where people had that sense of meaning and purpose was Liberia. It wasn't because life was sweet there, because to survive, they had to make deep commitments to the people around them. The commitments also give us our sense of morality and our sense of character. When my oldest was just born, he had a super low APGAR score, and they rushed him away to the intensive care ward. And as a parent, you're just sort of sitting there that he's gone off. And I remember thinking at that moment, suppose he dies after 30 minutes. Will it have been worth a lifetime of grief for his mother and I? And at that moment, I said, yeah, obviously. And if you had asked me before that moment, before experiencing fatherhood ever, I would have said, well, 30 minutes of a life that doesn't even know exists versus a lifetime of grief to 2 people, that doesn't make any sense at all. But once you're in that moment, having made that commitment or been surprised into that commitment of parenthood, it totally makes sense. Your logic changes. And once you've made that commitment, you want to honor that commitment, always be there for the kid. You start doing these self-sacrificial things you never would have done before. You may want to go running, but you're pushing the kid in the stroller. And after you do that enough, the habits of good character form, and eventually it engraves a better disposition in you. And so I just hold that up at the end, because to me, if anybody's looking for a sense of purpose and meaning, we've gone from the we're in this together, I'm free to be myself. We could go to revert to tribe, but I'd rather we go to an era which is communal and connected and yearning for the good, but based on our choice to forego future choices, which is I commit to you. Thank you. Now we can talk about Steve Bannon for the rest of the week. So questions and answers, I'm going to ask, again, the students, if students will be bold to raise their hand and call on them. If not, we can go to these. When I was here, we had graduate students who were in their 80s, 90s. Right here.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks. So one thing I found in populist politicians is that they are very good at co-opting 2 ideas associated with democracy. One is fairness. The other one is the idea of popular sovereignty, which has the refrain of taking back control. So this has the evidence in Brexit and Trump's rhetoric on border enforcement. But this taking back control public discourse is so prevalent in the United States that if I compare it with other emerging economy in face of the big forces, they talk a lot about adaptation rather than taking back control. So what do you think this taking back control mentality is a symptom of what you mentioned, loneliness and the crisis of meaning, or should we just pursue this taking back control and fulfill what democracy is all about?
So I would say it's a symptom of the underlying what Trump would call the carnage. And you can go into the world with two mentalities, an abundance mentality or a scarcity mentality. And if you come from a certain moral tradition, you go into the world with an abundance mentality, an implied state of nature of the Garden of Eden. And there's enough to go around. And that we can welcome other people because life is not zero sum. It's yes and. But if you have a different mentality, then your mentality is scarcity. It starts with a sort of a Hobbesian worldview, and that life is basically a struggle over resources that are zero sum. And when you have that mentality, the first thing you do is everything is friend-enemy distinction, which is if you watch Trump talk or Viktor Orban or the Brexit people, it's all friend-enemy distinctions. It's always us or them. It's always a warrior mentality. And that leads to a sense of apocalyptics. What's been interesting to me, especially going around the Trump country, but I think it's also true on the left, the idea if they win, we're doomed. I mean, I wouldn't have voted for, I'm not a huge Democratic supporter, haven't voted for too many Democrats in years and years, but if Hillary Clinton wins, she's a normal person. Would she do things I disagree with, but it's not the end of the republic. For a lot of Trump supporters, it absolutely is the end of the republic, what they call the Flight 93 election. The plane's going down, we have to do something desperate. And so you get that kind of apocalyptic mindset. And then out of that, you get a strong communal sense. And for people who have no sense of community, that gives them a very strong communal sense. And one of the things that has struck me about the Republican Party is that if you ask Republicans about 15 years ago, is being white part of your identity? 15 years ago, 13% said yeah. They didn't think about it much. Now 57% say yeah. And so they've glommed onto an identity. And my basic view of the whole Trump phenomenon is he's the wrong answer to the right question. That there is a lot of scarcity out there. They're responding to things for a reason, and their reasons are basically legitimate. But to me, they've gone off into a self-destructive way. But they feel a total alienation from their institutions, as a lot of people do, but maybe with a little more cause. And the final thing I'll say, and it's germane to the news of the day, is there's an organization that's in my column tomorrow called Better Angels. And they bring reds and blues together. They go from town to town, and they find people who are pretty intense in their red and pretty intense in their blue. They bring them into a room, but the reds don't want to show up because they think I'm just going to get beat up again. I'm tired of it. And so they say to the conservatives, we'll allow you to demonstratize yourself. And they say, well, if you let me do that, I'll go. And one of the things they do in the meetings is each side says, what are the stereotypes about you that the other side believes? And for the Reds, they always say first, they think we're racist. And I'm not a racist. And I support this and this and this, but for other reasons. And so they feel this great weight of shame, which society they feel is imposing upon them. And as a result, everything comes about that shame and that culture war. And I mention it now because we're having this debate about guns. And I'm for every gun control thing you can imagine. But one of the things we've learned about the gun debate is that it's not really about guns anymore. It's a cultural symbol for people who think those at the top of society look down upon them. And somehow to win that debate, you've got to deculture war the thing and say, yes, we respect you. In fact, the gun control movement is going to be led by people you respect who are from your community. And then you can depolarize it and actually have a conversation about guns rather than about, do you respect rural culture? So that's a long University of Chicago answer to a question about what I would call a scarcity mindset.
So I'm wondering.
There's a mic coming.
Oh, mic. Great. I'm wondering what you might consider to be a concrete formulation of the right answer to this right question. I mean, all this talk of the need to find some kind of common national narrative, you explain it to somebody who's struggling to pay the bills, and they'll say, well, it all sounds well and good. But like, what are you going to offer them? What could any kind of organization or movement offer them that would seem to solve their current problems and get them out of their current framework?
Yeah, well, I mean, the one thing, I mentioned all these buckets. One would be a new definition of America. And if you wanted to ask me which one I think is the best, it's carved in the Lincoln Memorial. It's the second inaugural. And it essentially says we're an experiment, and we've betrayed the experiment in a bunch of different ways. But we're early days in the experiment, and we're all in this together, and we will redeem the experiment, and we will go on a journey of forgiveness to honor the sense of betrayal people do feel. The second thing I would offer them is, I'm going to say, we're going to help you build community that's from the ground up, that is not community building by defending enemies, but community building by inclusion. And it's just a better way to live through love rather than hate. And so, for example, there's one organization that I'm a big fan of in Shreveport, Louisiana, called Community Renewal International. Shreveport is a bitterly divided city, racially and economically. And a guy named Mac McCarter created an organization called CRI. And basically, it's a little based on the settlement house movement. They've got residential homes on every block with a host family to create organization and community within that block. They've got settlement homes for the poorer areas, and they give everybody lawn signs and lapel pins and other things to identify that you're part of this community. And they have these little buttons called We Care. And 55,000 people out of the 250,000 people in Shreveport wear these buttons every day. And you go in the elevator or the building, you see somebody else with a button, you have something to talk about. And so that's the beginning of knitting a community from the bottom up. Then I would have a social mobility agenda. There are two parties in this country, but there are three movements. There's a conservative movement that believes in limiting government to enhance freedom, liberal movement that believes in increasing government to enhance equality. And then there used to be a movement that started with Alexander Hamilton and then went through the Whig Party that believes in limited but energetic government to enhance social mobility, investing huge amounts in human capital so they can become capitalists. And there are 6 Whigs left in the country, but I'm one of them. And I think that tradition actually is a recipe for these people if we only had a party to go along with it.
So often the way I see populism like worming its way into our politics is because politicians think they can sell people on the populist rhetoric, and then when they actually get to Congress, they just do what they were going to do anyways. It's just like a slogan to them. But so I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts about that approach are, whether it really works. And then on the other hand, if you reject that approach, the difficult thing seems to be like 90% of politics is just really boring. There's a lot of really like just technocratic, really detail-oriented policy. So how do you sell people on that if you're not just going to use like a populist slogan? If you're not going to be deceptive, how do you sell people on the boring stuff?
Yeah. Well, first, some populists do that. It's sort of a bait and switch. I mean, every campaign, Democrat, but especially Republican over the last 50 years, has been an anti-Washington campaign, which is strange because that's where they're running to go. But you have to have that. And sometimes it's bait and switch. In the case of Trump, I think we're imposing a false order on Trump to say it's a bait and switch. I think he genuinely does have populist instincts, but he's just not organized enough to actually implement it. And that, frankly, there aren't a lot of Trumpians with which he could staff an administration. And it's interesting, within the administration, it's very sad. I know people are in it. I had one person came up to me, she'd been in the administration maybe 6 months, and she said, I've heard in past administrations there was a sense of camaraderie. Is that true? And I said, yeah, there really was. They don't feel any of that. To be in an administration is to be imagine the biggest crush you had in 5th grade. That's what every administration staffer has for the president in normal administrations. I remember once in Obama, I was interviewing somebody in the administration, and Obama left the White House to get on a helicopter. He interrupted our interview so he could turn around and look out the window to see Obama's back for 20 seconds as he walked out. And then I could see his heart beating. And it was like, but nobody feels that. In this administration, it's all manipulation. What can we say to manipulate Trump to do what we want him to do? And he's, of course, manipulating them, and he's better at it. And so it's just this weird sadness that pervades the federal government among the career people and the political people. As for why people should believe in government, I'll just say a few things. Mike Gerson, who was here a week ago, he has a saying that if thinking you don't need to care about politics is a sign that you live in a privileged environment. Because people who live where you could get shot in the back of the head or you have to pay a bribe every 5 minutes, you don't have the luxury of not caring about politics. The second thing to stick with government, and to stick with Gerson, is that everybody I know who served in government, and I have not, that's the most important moment of their lives. That's the intense hour. I mean, Gerson helped start this organization called PEPFAR, which is our anti-HIV program in Africa, which saved 13 million lives. Where else you can have that kind of impact? I have another friend who just left the Obama administration, and she said every individual day sucked, but the whole experience was tremendously rewarding. And that's sort of what it's like. And I just find that if you really want to do good, the scale of good you can do in politics is just greater than anything else. And the reason we believe in it, because if you have a diverse society, there are two ways to govern it. One is through force, and one is through compromise and conversation. And I'm a big fan of that movie Lincoln, the Daniel Day-Lewis one, because that showed what politics actually can look like. And it's a craft, it's like a skill to be admired. There was a guy named Dick Darman who, he loved stories about how you actually do politics and the nitty-gritty. And he told me a story about a guy some of you may remember named Mel Laird, who I think was Secretary of Defense under Nixon. And Laird had no hair. And there used to be in those days a White House barber. And every Wednesday afternoon at 3, he would make an appointment with a White House barber, which he did not need to do. So why did he do this? Because in the Pentagon, the secretary's schedule goes through all the building. And at 3 in the afternoon, it would say, Laird to White House. And they thought he was meeting with the president, but he was actually just going to the barber. But that gave him a little power in the building. And so knowing the tricks of how to govern is like it's a skill, it's a craft. Questions for anybody? Right here, sir, in the chair.
It's rather distressing to hear the reasons why people don't want Bannon to come here. And actually, there aren't reasons at all. It's rather a self-righteousness that I shouldn't be complicit or I shouldn't be required to engage in discourse. But going back to what you just said a moment ago about the craft of politics, a lot of that is to engage with people that you not only disagree with, but you might be inclined to hate or to kill if you could get away with it. But it's very distressing that here, even at the University of Chicago, where we supposedly believe in discourse, that there seems to be a lack of confidence that if I actually had to converse or debate with Steve Bannon, I could think of nothing to say to him. All I could do is, kill him or refuse to acknowledge it. But what do you think universities should do? I've thought that there should actually be classes in debating people you violently disagree with, that should actually be addressed.
Well, I mean, Chicago is the outlier in the country. I mean, it's taken the purest, in my view, the best position. One of my colleagues, Bret Stephens, wrote a column about Bob Zimmer called "The Best College President in America," which upset me because I used to be his favorite New York Times columnist, and now. And I think that's absolutely the right position. And if you establish that clarity, then everything should be clear. I will say it's not the position anywhere else. And it's been striking to me, I go to a lot of college campuses, and on every single one, I have debates with the students on should you allow bad speakers, offensive speakers to speak. It comes up in every single campus visit. And in every single place, students are, no, that what they're saying is evil. And it's violence, and we can't allow that to happen. Now, why there is this difference among a lot of people who think that we all have these psychological reasons I don't quite trust. But it is, for some reason, the common faith in just that free speech and discourse precedes everything else, that philosophy is much weaker. And to me, a lot of it is just some of us were raised with the curriculum of democracy. And a lot of us have forgotten it, and I've forgotten a lot of it. I've gone back to think, like, why am I for pluralistic democracy? And so I've been looking for the literature I should have remembered or I should have read on why we do this, why we believe this. One of this, Thomas Mann, the novelist, came here in the 1940s. He gave a series of lectures called The Eventual Triumph of Democracy. And it was rousing rhetoric about why democracy was not just a procedure for electing people, but was a noble way of life. John Stuart Mill's On Liberty is another version of this. They believed in democracy with a sort of a moral fervor, that it's a beautiful thing that gives purpose to life, that I think a lot of us have just forgotten the gospel. And that's part of the revival, I would say, that has to happen.
Seems to be one of the greatest changes I've observed in our society over the last decade is the end of a common accepted truth among Americans. And to me, it's only accelerated in the last couple years. And so my question would be, can we heal as a country or go in a new direction when 30 or 40% of the nation thinks your own employer, the New York Times, is fake news? And how does that affect our ability to create a common dialogue again?
And sometimes I think the basis of all the problems is a lack of intellectual virtue. Like there are certain intellectual virtues which, when I went here, we still had some of these professors who were German refugees from World War II. And there was a famous one named Karl Weintraub who taught Western Civ. And he wrote to a friend of mine who was a classmate of mine who's now president of Davidson College named Carol Quillen. He wrote to her at the end of his career about how he poured himself into the students. And actually one of his students, Ruth O'Brien, is right over there. And he thought, he said, I want them to take these books as seriously as the men and women who wrote them, for whom these books were matters of life and death. And I pour themselves into the students, and I think it works on them, but I just don't know. And it was the exhaustion that a lot of professors and teachers feel, that you pour more in sometimes than students are able to receive. But it takes years and then they receive it. It's like planting seeds. But one of the things they taught us was first the fervor of this great intellectual tradition. That we didn't necessarily have to believe what they believed, or Kant or Nietzsche, but we saw how fervently they believed in it. And that I found deeply inspiring. The second thing they taught us, which was how to see, like how to see the world. And as my colleague Brett Stevens, who also went here, said, they taught us how to argue by seeing the other points of view as well as we tried to see our own. And there's a quote from John Ruskin I'm going to mangle, but he said, the more I think about it, the more I realize the most important thing any person ever does is to see something and describe what they saw in a plain way. Thousands can talk for everyone who can think, but millions can think for everyone who can see. And so one of the things you do when you come to a place like this is you encounter people who really see clearly. To me, the hero is Tolstoy. He just saw reality so clearly. Another hero of mine is George Orwell. In his essays, he describes the world around him with just such crystalline clarity. And that's not a thing that comes naturally, that's a skill to be taught. And if you get out of the habit of teaching it, then people just dismiss whatever they don't feel like believing. And Orwell's phrase was the power to face unpleasant thoughts. And that's something to be taught. It's not a natural thing.
You seem to make the case in your talk that an antidote to tribalism is having a deep web of commitments. But it seems like people who voted for Trump were people with a deep web of commitments, evangelicals, right. People in rural communities. So why else would you, I guess, explain their enthusiasm for him?
Yeah, Goering and Goebbels were totally committed. They had commitments. And so to me, when I say commitment making, it's, I do think the tribal mentality, what differentiates it, they both seem like the same sort of thing. But to me, the tribal mentality begins from a position of hatred. There's always a definition of the border and the boundary. and the other. And you define yourself by what the other is, and it's always about erecting barriers and unity around threat. But a commitment mentality, to me, as I say, it's falling in love with something, whether it's David falling in love with a woman, or somebody falling in love with libertarianism, or falling in love with the South Side of Chicago. And then out of that love, you don't have a sense of other. You have a sense of approaching from a position of expansiveness. And then one of the book I discovered here that changed my whole life was Reflections on the Revolution in France by Edmund Burke. And he had a concept, his most famous concept is little platoons. But the family is linked to the platoon is linked to the town is linked to the region is linked to the nation is linked to the world. And so it's a series of cups holding each other. And so you're always against the other, because you're all part of the same community of communities. And so it's a quite opposite mentality, but that gets you to a place of belonging. And so to me, we're never going to go back to the age of authority, where John Farley could say, I followed the boss. That's just, we're too individualistic. We're never going back there. And we're probably not going to stay in the realm of individualism where we've been. So one form of communal activity or another is going to lead us, and it's whether we have an ethos of hatred or an ethos of loving embrace. To me, that's the difference. I'm letting you decide. There's a woman in the red or burnt orange, whatever color that is.
So thinking about the value of community, I'm curious about what you think about keeping that discourse relevant as people sort of become desensitized to the sort of state of the way society is. I know for me, I have my parents' nostalgia that motivates me, but in sort of thinking about people who are younger than I am, who will sort of then move into positions of power, who may not have known the era of community, how do we sort of keep that alive?
Yeah. At least you've got your parents' nostalgia to live for. I've never heard that before. Get your own nostalgia. I'll say a couple things. One is I had a nice conversation with a bunch of students just before, and I think there is a sense that the local is still sort of healthy. There are parts of the local that are healthy, whether it's communities or whether it's towns. One of the things we're seeing in America is all these cities are rising. And some of them are big. I'm from New York. I think New York's, if you can afford it, is in great shape. But a lot of cities that are not rich are in great shape. Greenville, South Carolina, Fresno, California, Wichita, Eau Claire, Wisconsin, Grand Rapids. There's a lot of cities, there's a lot of local beauty right now in America. The problem is trying to scale it. And that's what I'm trying to do in some of my work. I have a friend who said, caution. I said, you take all these great NGO community organizations, can you put them together into one national movement to address our national problems? And I said, I think that's worth trying. He said, yeah, good luck with that. I've tried that for 30 years. The thing you have to remember is those organizations are all distinct and local and usually built around a person. They're super hard to scale and nationalize. That's a useful warning. But I do think there's just, what people have faith in is the power of community. I have a friend, and which is why there's so much separatism in the air. I have a friend named Rod Dreher who wrote a book called The Benedict Option about why Christians should remove themselves from the mainstream culture and revert back to community. But before that, he wrote a book called The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming, which is about his sister, a woman named Ruthie, who was one of those people which was incandescent personalities. And she was a teacher in this little town in northern Louisiana, 800 people. And unfortunately, Ruthie died when she was in her early 40s of cancer. And because she was the person she was, even though the town only had 800 people, there were 1,600 people at her funeral. And she loved to go barefoot, so the fireman, her husband was a fireman, the fireman who carried her casket to the grave carried her barefoot, just sort of in tribute to her. But one of the things she did, and this story sort of stayed with me from the book, is on Christmas Eve every year, she would go to the town cemetery and say, on Christmas Eve, the dead should be remembered. And so she would put a candle on every gravestone. And then the year she died just before Christmas Eve. And Rod was back with his mom and family. And on Christmas Eve, he said, should we go to the cemetery and do what Ruthie used to do? And his mom said, in future years, I think I'd love to do that, but this year it's just too tough. so let's not do it. And so they decided not to do it, and they drove to another family's home, and they happened to drive by the cemetery, and somebody had put a candle on every gravestone. And to me, that's a symbol of the way community works. Somebody sets a norm, and other people get picked up by it, and then they behave. And so to me, we sort of get that. We've all tasted that at some point in our lives. And so I do think that's the hopeful start to build. We'll have time for one more question. Let's make it a long, rambling one with no question at the end of it.
I'll try to avoid that. So using your ratchet, hatchet, pivot paradigm, in my opinion, it seems like the current president is doing an outsized job of hatcheting. And so I'm curious if you think that presidents to come are going to do an outsized job of pivoting and ratcheting, or if it's wrong for us as a society to continue placing faith in an individual, in the president, and putting so much power in that office beyond what's constitutionally invested in it, and instead look elsewhere in society.
Yeah, that paradigm, ratchet habit, it's actually just sort of based on Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. They have a paradigm, it works for a while, it stops working, then you have this period where you have a competition of paradigms, and then somebody figures that out and they get a new paradigm. And I totally believe in that, which is why I'm optimistic. I think it's always a mistake to discount the power of human ingenuity to figure it out. And I do think we're just going to figure it out, somebody. And we'll have a different culture to look very different than it does right now, in the way 1975 looked very different from 1955. Now, as for your question, to me, the most important layer, I have a friend who was a classmate from, I don't think this is a betrayal, a classmate of mine here, and he would be the first to tell you he was the biggest screw-up in our class. And so, of course, he now has a hedge fund and $8 billion. And he's a big donor to Republican cause that hates Trump. And he said, well, who should I give to? And as I was thinking about that question, I was thinking that's sort of the wrong level right now. That to me, the level, we have a sort of a nest within which we conduct our politics. Sort of what's at stake here is not only what politically we believe, but the rules of the game by which we have politics. And so when I describe the loss of civic union, the loss of of basic equality, the loss of a national story, the loss of a sense of peoplehood, the loss of meaning, these are deeper than politics. And to me, most of the answers will come from civic society, not from politicians. Politicians never can leap out when there's not a group of people there to hold them up. And so there has to be that group first. Having said that, I have no clue which way politics is going to go in the short term. I'll end on a nice pessimistic note. We can all go suck on the gas pipe after this. I personally think it's going to get a little worse before it gets better. I think the Republican Party is not going to snap back to the sort of party I would want. I think the white identity is really deep in it. The alt-right is a real thing. And so I can't imagine we'll get somebody like Trump, but we'll get somebody embracing the basic message. And the Democratic Party, I don't have any crystal ball, but I just look at what's happening to the center-left in Europe, and it's just collapsing. Liberal Democrats in Germany are like practically not a party. Same with the Labour Party, same in Israel. And so I have to assume that's happened here. Now, if you're on the left, if you're like Bernie Sanders, then you're sitting pretty. But if you're like me, sort of more in the mushier middle, or the muscular middle, it's a little despairing. But I have basic faith in the country. The final thing I'll say, to be upbeat, is that if you read books written by people like me through the decades, they're always way too pessimistic. It's always the end of this, the decline of that, and we're always wrong. And the students at this great university will solve all our problems. Thank you.